Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 4 on this series on Introduction to Game Maker, created for the students at Saturday Academy. I am your instructor, Will Patillo, and today we're going to be dealing with enemies and a very basic AI system, which will hopefully be building this in a way that is extensible. First, I'm going to create my new enemy object, and I'm just going to start off right now because I'm sure a game will eventually have lots of different enemies. So I'm going to create a group by going into Objects, Add Group, and calling that Enemies. And then within this, I'm going to create an object, and I will call this, I'll just call this Enemy. Enemy 1 for now. And to use the Game Maker convention, obj underscore enemy 1. And this is going to need a sprite, so I will create one with a new sprite. And I'm just going to draw something really fast right here. I'll just make a circle. Let's see, just take this, and I'll just make it this kind of orangey color, and yeah, that's good enough. So there's my wonderful enemy right here. And then I'm just going to give it some little dots to give it a little sense of what direction it's facing, and I'll have it going to the right. Okay. And that's important. Don't make your original sprite facing upwards, because we're going to be modifying the rotation of this, and since right is 0, this is just going to make the most sense. Alright, so I have my enemy with a sprite on it, and now I need to be able to make it move on its own. Now, we've already handled movement with our move script, which we're calling in our various key press events, and the enemy is going to move in exactly the same way, except that it's not going to be listening to these key press events. So it needs to be calling this move script somehow else. Now, the method I'm going to use is I'm going to have my enemy just make decisions once per second. And each second, it will pick a different direction to move. Maybe it'll shoot a projectile later on. So we'll start off by adding a create event. And that, 1 second, that's something we're going to have to specify somewhere. So I'm just going to create a variable right now. And I will just call this reaction time, and set it to 60 frames per second, as set in my main options right here, 60 game frames per second. So a value of 60 in reaction time is going to equate to 1 second. Now I'm going to want to do something on a repeated basis, once per second, in this many frames, repeated. So to have something execute at a later time, I'm going to use something called an alarm. So let's see, if I look that up, I can see set an alarm countdown. And I'll just put that right here. And for now, actually, I'm just going to set this countdown to 0 this first time around in my create event, because I want it to make its first decision right as the game starts. And yes, I'll leave this alarm set to 0 right here. There's a number of options. Again, kind of like with your arguments, you start counting at 0 and increment up every time you need a new one, and then you start back at 0 whenever you're in a new context. So like a new event or a new script. So next, I need to specify what happens when this alarm countdown completes. So I'm going to go to Add Event and look for alarms and go with alarm 0. So this event will start once this alarm countdown reaches 0. So when we have this set alarm countdown, we'll start an alarm, and it's going to start at 0, and then it's going to start ticking down, and once it reaches 0, which in this case is going to be instantaneous, then this alarm is going to fire. Now, next thing we want to have happen is for this alarm to happen repeatedly. So for that, I'm just going to set this alarm countdown again right inside of here. set to alarm 0 again, so that is itself. And I'm going to set its countdown to reaction time. So before in create, our countdown was set to 0. Now it is set to reaction time, which is that value of 60. So right at the beginning, our alarm will fire instantly, and then the alarm will set its countdown to 60, and it'll start ticking down, which will take about 1 second before it reaches 0, and then this alarm will fire again. And then that'll set its countdown back up to 60, and the process will repeat endlessly. So we now have an event that fires once per second. And if we ever want to change how long it takes for this to fire, all we have to do is change the reaction time. We can do that in the create and just have it always make a decision once every half second, or we could even change this value dynamically while the program's running so that the amount of time between each decision varies as the game progresses. But for now, we're just going to keep this at once per second throughout this. All right, so now that we have this repeating event, now we need to actually move. So, well, that should be simple enough. We can just execute a script and call move. Now, as I remember, move required some arguments. So we're going to need to fill those in, otherwise we're going to run into errors. So let's take a look at our scripts, and let's take a look at this. This has an argument 0 for a direction variable. Okay, so we need to send in a direction, and we also need to send in a sprite. All right, that's fine. So I'm going to go into my object enemy, and so for my argument 0, I need a direction to move. So for this, we're going to have, there's all kinds of things you can do for AI. For this, we're just going to make it random. So for randomization, let's see what happens if I start looking at random. Right here, so we have get a random number. That's useful for some things. We'll get that later. Randomize, we'll get that later. And choose. This is the one that we want. Randomly chooses one of the supplied arguments. So I'm going to take this and put this in here. And actually, just for readability, I'm going to take my alarm countdown and set that at the end, so that basically you do all the things and then reset the alarm. It doesn't matter, because this is all going to happen in the same frame. But just it's going to follow convention a little better. So in this choose, my enemy can move in 4 different directions. And so right now it's only giving me one option, so I'm going to increase that. 1, 2, 3. So I have 4 different options. And now, because I have macros defined over here, right, up, left, and down, and what I'm trying to get is directions, I can just use these macros again in my choice options. So I can just say right here, I'm going to go into all caps so it matches right, up, left, and down. Okay. So what this choose is going to do is it's going to pick one of these, and it's going to assign whichever one it chooses to a variable. And, well, we need to know what variable it's going to assign one of these directions towards. And that is what this target field is for. Using in general programming sense, a target is like a return value. So this is calling like a method, it's like a script. You can think of this as a script that's built into GameMaker, and this processes some things. Instead of setting values like we've been doing so far in our scripts, it's going to return a value back to whatever called it, and then set that in whatever variable you say in the target. So I'm going to call this, in lowercase, facing. And I'm only using it in here. I'm just creating the variable right now and using it in this event. So I'm going to hit the temp tick box. Without the temp, I think this would cause an error since it's, facing isn't declared yet, and that would be an easy fix. I would just have to go into create and assign a variable to, facing to whatever, and then I would be able to just use it. But rather than create a variable and add something to our create code, I'm just going to make it a temp so that I'm only using it here, and I can always change it later if necessary. So now I have a variable called facing that holds one of these directions. So now I have something to put into this argument field, just facing. This, again, is the direction, argument 0, that we need for movement. Now, the other thing we need is a sprite. So I'll just say, for this, add a new argument to here, and for the object, so for the player we had 4 different sprites. For the enemy we're just going to use 1 and rotate it around, but before we get to rotation I'm just going to make sure that this is working so far, so I'll just say, oh, and I did not rename my enemy sprite yet, SPR enemy. Okay. So now in this field I just type in SPR enemy. And that supplies all the arguments that it needs, and now I need to actually place some of these enemies in the scene, or the room, I should say. I'm so used to working in Unity. So I'm going to take an object enemy, and I'm going to put it there, and that's a little bigger than I want it to be. So I'm going to go into my sprite enemy and change the size right here. So this is in sprite size. Right now it's 64 by 64, and I can just go into the scale image and turn it down to 32 by 32 and apply. Now if I look in my main, now it is filling a single square, which is more the size that I want. If you'd like yours to be bigger, then go ahead and leave it at 64, or maybe even make it 128, or you can make different enemies of different sizes. So I'm going to create a couple of these, and I'm going to put one, start with like where my player can see it, and save, and let's see what happens. Okay, this enemy is not moving. What is happening? Alright, so our move is setting a walk speed, and right, because walk speed is defined for a player, and it's using that to set its actual speed. However, walk speed is a just variable that we've created for ourselves. So we need to actually give walk speed to this sprite enemy. So I'm going to go into create and add a new variable, and just throw this in here and go to walk speed, and we'll just set this to however fast we want these characters to move. I'm going to go with a value of 3 just to demonstrate it. And they're still not moving. And the problem why they're not moving, as I actually just realized a mistake that I made just now, is this alarm countdown setting it to 0 right at the beginning. That doesn't actually work. We're just going to set this to 1 so it happens on the next frame. Otherwise this alarm never actually fires. Now alternatively we could leave this out, or just set this to the full reaction time, and then just execute this choose and move and this sort of stuff right off the bat. But this should work. Also, so that the enemy doesn't jump out of view, or just to make debugging purposes a little easier, I've just put one enemy in the scene and set its walk speed to 1, something a little bit slower so I can see what is happening. Now when I run the game, I can see my enemy is moving. Now it's changing directions, going up and back down again, and left, and up, and yeah, and so on. Now, one thing that will occur, I'm just going to test this, notice this time it's following the exact same pattern, up, down, up, and then left. If I run it again, down, up, down, and then left, in the exact same time. Every single time I do this, it's going to be following the exact same pattern. And maybe that's not a problem, but I mean, we're trying to make this random, and if it's exactly the same pattern every single time, that just doesn't seem right. So the reason for that, and that kind of gets into like how randomness works, this isn't really random. It just uses the really tricky formula that is basically so complex that it's, or not really complex, so convoluted that it's totally unpredictable. And what unpredictable values it chooses is going to depend on a lot of things, but one of which is a seed that it starts with. And so if you give it the same seed every time, then it's going to produce the same values given the same conditions. So to make it a little more convincingly random, we're going to have it pick a different random seed every time we run the game. And now for this, I'm just going to go into my object macros. I mean, I could create another controller object, but and also actually, since I'm using it for a number of different purposes, I'm going to just call this controller. All right. So I have my controller, and right now, just I have a create event right where I'm creating these macros. I'm going to do one other thing, and I'm going to look for random. And now I'm going to use this randomize. This creates a random seed used by the random number generator. And I'm going to just take this and put this in here, and that should be all that I need. So let's see now if I save and run this. Okay, let's see. That's following the same path. Maybe it's because I have not put this controller in the room. So let's take this controller, put it in there, and try it again. And that actually that looks a little different. Run this again. Yes, and now it's starting to the left and moving around. So you only need one object in your scene that has this randomized thing in it. And once you've placed this somewhere, you're done with worrying about random seeds. And essentially, you should just view that at the start of every project, because you need it for, like, if anywhere in your game you use some sort of choose or pick a random number within a range, anywhere, then you're going to need to set a random seed at some point, and you only really need to do that once. There's not really any benefit in having choosing a random seed multiple times. So that's out of the way. All right, so now we have our enemy that can move in random different directions, and I'm just going to place several more of them in the scene, like this. Get rid of that one, and if I run it again, now I can see all of them are moving randomly in their own directions, and they're all like separately choosing different paths to randomly move around in. These enemies are able to move over these terrain objects and also overlap with the player. I'd like some collisions that prevent them from running into each other. So like if I hit one and then we just stop. Well, there's a very easy way to do that. Since we've set up our colliders using this base collider as a parent, all we have to do is recognize that our player and our enemies, they have sprites already, and we just set their parent to this object collider base, and do the same thing with the player. So let's see, set its parent to object collider base. And so now, if I look into my enemy, actually my sprite enemy, and I look at its collision mask, and also just to prevent any weirdnesses later on, I'm going to go ahead and set this to the full image for its collision mask. Now, this collision is going to be looking for these box and other colliders on the edge and features of the map, as well as the collision mask on the player, and the player is going to look for the enemy as well. And so they are so now the player is not going to be able to overlap with the enemy. However, one other thing that we still need is that the logic for actually responding to these colliders is in the step event on the player. So I'm going to need to copy and paste this over to my enemy as well. So I'm just take these two actions right here and copy, and now go over into my enemy and add a regular step event, and then paste those in here. And once again, it just has to look for object collider base, and then it'll find everything that inherits from it, which includes the player and all the other things around. And that's it. So let's see what happens when we run this. So now, when the player walks into an enemy, it stops. And also, you notice that enemy just stopped a moment ago because it ran into this. Also, this is a little harder to control, but an enemy will stop when it touches the player. So now, in addition to having collisions with the environment, we also have collisions between various objects, and we got a little bit of gridlock over here. So, yeah, a little bit of extension of the collision system there. All right, one more thing I want to add to this video is right now these enemies are always facing the same direction, and I want them to change direction every time they move. And I'm just going to keep the same sprite, just for simplicity. You could make different directions for the sprite, kind of the same as the players have, and you know, which is good if you want them to not just be totally mirrored, to actually look different when they're facing different ways. And you know, that might be better, but I think it's good to cover different ways of doing things so that you see as many concepts as possible. So again, with anything with you know, thinking in terms of how to make stuff in GameMaker, start with when, then go to what. So the when is when it's going to change direction is whenever it makes a decision. Every time it changes the direction that it's moving, and that is in this alarm 0 event. So I've just moved, and I've created this target facing, and this is set to a value. So now I can just, let's see, I'm dealing with rotation, so let's see, set our instance rotation. And I can just take this and set this here, and I can set its angle to facing, because this has just received a 0, 90, 180, or 270, and I think that's it. So let's set and save and run this, and now we have our enemies changing direction. But you'll see that they're kind of jumping around in some kind of weird ways. The reason for that is something I forgot when I was creating their sprite. Go over in here, bring this over, zoom it in, and it's because the anchor point is in the top left. So this is like the point, the pivot point on which it rotates. So if it's going to left, it's here. But if it turns up, then this box is going to be like around up here because it's just rotated around this point and gone up over this direction. If it's down, it's going to pivot around this point and then kind of be like in this space. So easy fix, just set its pivot point to middle center and run it. And now we'll see the directions look a lot more reasonable. Okay, I am going to end it there. Next time we'll start dealing with these enemies firing projectiles out and potentially hitting the player. But that is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.